Hello everyone, welcome to Natixis. We are very pleased to welcome you to this usual end-of-year session around this discussion that we have regarding next year. Outlook 2022 is the subject of the day. We try to share with you, to have this discussion around the big thematics that we think are of interest for your investment, your portfolio within our expert within the research. So as usual, I hear a lot that next year is very complicated in terms of forecasts, in terms of scenarios. Well, I guess it's more like a probability story. It's the same every year. It's very complicated. Once a French humorist said, forecasts are very difficult, in particular when they concern the future. Well, this is the case. We are going to discuss 2022 with our experts, with a macroeconomic tour of the big subject of the day. So the US economy, where it's going, China as well. Lots of things are happening in China, but as well Europe, and all about energy. And we have some specialists within the research on that. And after that, we will discuss markets, we'll discuss central banks, rates, FX, but as well credit or asset allocation. So we will try to cover a lot of things. What I suggest to you is to use as much as possible the Q&A question and answers that you can have on your top right hand of your screen to make it the more lively as possible. I will can ask your question to the participant as much as possible. That's where it's more interesting when it's interactive. So do not hesitate. Use the Q&A. If you miss something, we are about to publish this afternoon, Paris time, and tomorrow morning for the rest the document Outlook 22 of all the research departments. So do not hesitate to take a look at that. And as usual, use the website of Natixis, the Twitter account, Research Natixis. We try to publish a lot of things on that. So maybe to start with, we have two things to start the session around the macroeconomics with the US. We have a studio live in the US. It's about to be connected, I guess. And after that, we have this roundtable, and maybe I can present the roundtable, starting with Alicia Garcia-Herrero, or great specialist of China. We have the great pleasure of having Alicia coming to Europe to participate to this panel. So at the price of 2 or 3 weeks of quarantine back home. But thank you very much for being here, Alicia. We are very pleased to have you on board. Then we have Dirk Schumacher, our chief economist for Europe. Alicia being the chief economist for Asia. Dirk used to work a long time. Well, not long time ago, but within the ECB, leading economist within the ECB. So lots of things to discuss with Dirk. And last but not least, Joel Hancock is our specialist on energy, and we think it's very interesting to discuss about gas, natural gas, especially all the commodities. Is it going to last? Can we see that there is a super cycle of commodities, or is it just temporary? So Joel is on the top 3 of the best forecaster worldwide for nat gas. So maybe it's too much to ask to see exactly where it's going, because it was quite of a surprise to see this quite a volatility on nat gas prices. But still, we will discuss this story with Joel just after. So I don't know if we have the connection with the US to start with.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So we have the great pleasure today to welcome Larry Kudlow. Larry Kudlow is a former director of National Economists Council under the Trump administration, and it's very interesting because he led the domestic and global economic agenda. So he has this front seat on almost everything within the White House. So very pleased. Thank you very much, Larry, to be with us today. And Larry will be interviewed directly from the US by Joe Lavorgna. Joe is our chief economist for America, and before that he was a chief economist back in the White House. He has the pleasure to work with Larry Kudlow within the White House as a chief economist. So thank you both of you to be with us today. We will start with you. Lots of the of the future depends on America and what's going on there. I guess it's leading the pack in many things, be it in economics, regarding the inflation story as well, but as well regarding probably the central bank normalization. So many subjects to cover. Thank you very much once again to both of you. If you have any question for Larry and Joe, do not hesitate on the Q&A. But first thing first, I'll leave it to Joe to discuss with Larry. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jean-François. Thank you, Larry. I get the sense we're at an inflection point. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but can you just frame how you saw the year coming in and how your view might have changed and what you're looking for in 2022, specifically with GDP and inflation?
Well, I thought the year coming in would be strong because you and your service to the NEC, by the way, was fantastic. And I want everyone to know, I hope it doesn't hurt you, but President Trump loved Joe Livornia because he knew he was a famous Wall Street economist and welcomed him into the fold. Look, we had a V-shaped recovery.
The president called it an I-shaped.
Sometimes he called it an I-shaped. Sometimes he called it a super V. You and I were out there selling that. We were getting killed by the political media that wouldn't buy into it. But I think it was true. And coming into the year, it should have been a very rosy year, to be honest. Now, what we probably didn't know, or perhaps what I didn't know, was how risky economic policy was going to become because of a very sharp shift to the left and excessive spending and then more spending, not just emergency spending, but making the emergency spending permanent and then threatening to raise a lot of taxes to finance it, which will ultimately damage the economy next year and the year after, if it goes through. I don't know that it's going to go through. The biggest disappointment, I think, is the energy story, because the new administration went right after re-regulating energy, fossil fuels, which stifled American production. We are 2 million barrels a day short of oil production. From early 2020, it was about 13 million per day in change. Then it dropped to 11 million during the pandemic and the shutdown, and it stayed at 11 million. And really, much of the rise in gasoline prices can be traced to that right there. You know, if we could produce, we would produce, and we wouldn't have this problem. So that's probably the biggest disappointment. And I think also, Joe, I would say this. I think the Federal Reserve monetary story has been way too stimulative for too long. So, in a sense, the federal government in general is still pursuing an emergency fiscal and monetary policy long after the emergency has passed. That's my view. And that's probably the main reason why, in the short and medium run, inflation has jumped, probably more than anybody thought. And now we're going to have to work that off, and it's not going to be easy. And if this big social spending tax bill passes, that will add a threat, because supply-side incentives are going to be damaged if these things go through. I don't know that they'll go through, incidentally. I'm just saying if they did. So the growth story is okay.
What would you say growth this year? Put a whole number on growth this year, GDP, and say next year.
Well, you know,
your best guess.
I usually leave that to you for these kinds of things. But I mean, I think you'll have a very strong fourth quarter. Atlanta Fed GDP now is about 8.
So maybe 5% for the year, 5 to 6 for the year.
Yeah, 6%. But unfortunately, the inflation rate's going to be 5-6%.
What's the best case you think inflation goes to next year? Assuming you don't get the taxes and the additional spending. It's got to be above 3, I would think.
Oh, I think so. I mean, look, the primary source of inflation is always monetary policy. I mean, I know we have these supply chain issues and so forth, and demand is leading supply as business reopen. But that should be very temporary. And the whole level of prices would not rise this much if the Fed weren't financing it. okay? So whatever you look at, whether it's price indicators in the market or money indicators, they're way, way too easy, accommodative. And so I don't see any, I mean, I think, look, here, let me go back. Janet Yellen said Sunday, okay, that the inflation would not come down until the second half of next year. Now, that's a pretty good argument for her. It's not a phony argument, because her colleagues are saying if you pass another $4 trillion in spending, inflation is going to come down.
And now, Larry, I just wanted to interject one thing. The $4 trillion, that's on a $2 trillion bill is 4 if scored.
Oh, yeah.
So the old 3.5 is like 6, 5 to 6.
Would have been.
Right. Okay. So I'm sorry. Just want to put that context in.
But we don't know that yet,
right,
because the House is remarking. There's going to be a manager's amendment probably voted on sometime later this week. We'll see what's in that. But it will be rejected by the Senate. So the process is going to take a long time. But I'm just saying, without that, current monetary trends, I think, have baked in the cake a high inflation number next year.
Connection with New York? Sorry to see that. Well, we just seems to be losing the connection with New York. I guess we can wait a couple of seconds. Sorry for that technical issue. If not, we can move to take a few questions on China or on the US. And please do not hesitate to ask questions that we can ask to Larry. Larry is quite optimistic, like he said, for the US economy, 6% this year probably, which is around the same numbers that we run within Natixis research, and we are around 5.5. Where we are a little bit more pessimistic is regarding next year. We are at 2.5% GDP growth next year in the US, so quite a slowdown in the US. We're talking a lot by excess spending, like Larry and Joe put it, but in our view, in fact, when you compare the deficit to GDP this year compared to next, we have quite of a slowdown, and the net effect of this Biden infrastructure and family plan in the end are going to be not that supportive. And once again, it's over 10 years. Most of it is financed by taxes, so the net effect on the U.S. economy, in our view, is going to be much lower. So maybe waiting for connection to be back. You can see the relationship between the U.S. and Europe is sometimes difficult. So we were going to move to China just to do a bit of an intermediate with Alicia Garcia-Herrero. So Alicia Garcia-Herrero is our chief economist for Asia. I repeat, one of the great specialists of China worldwide. I'm not afraid to say so. So a lot of questions around China these days, where China is going. We see a kind of a new revolution in China. Maybe first question on China, Alicia, will be around the COVID. We see that China is at the forefront of this zero COVID policy. Is it something that you would call successful? Is it risky for the GDP growth, or is it the way forward? How do you see that?
It was successful at the beginning. China's success was in 2020. It isn't as much in 2021 because the rest of the world is opening. And I think it will be a disaster in 2022 if they remain convinced that that's the way forward, because it's going to continue to soften services by all means and purposes. People are moving even within China. Increasingly, so we have 19 provinces with some restrictions, but also manufacturing increasingly, because there's a connection. I mean, there's the COVID, but there's also the energy crisis. So, both together make it pretty gloomy. And so far, we've not seen an impact of the zero COVID strategy on cross-border financial movement, whether it's foreign direct investment or portfolio investment. But I think it's going to come to affect investment as well, because at the end of the day, if you can't really run, your company in China because you can't enter China, that's not going to be sustainable. So yes, it is very costly for China. I think it's very political to keep this zero COVID in there. And we're seeing already quite a reduction in mobility in China as compared to the rest of Asia, where mobility is coming back to the levels of Europe or the US. Yeah.
Very interesting. I don't know if we have back to the US connection or not, or if we continue with China. Well, let's try to be back with Larry and Joe in the US. Can you hear me, Joe?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Great.
We were switching to China, so that's going to be another round of questions for after. So I'll leave it to you again. Sorry for this interruption.
Okay, yeah, no worries. So you accurately sort of gave Larry's general view, which is similar to ours. Growth this year very strong, inflation elevated, but then next year, of course, things moderating with inflation still staying high. I was asking Larry when we lost the connection. This comes back to Fed policy and Larry's astute point about inflation always and everywhere being a monetary phenomenon. The futures market right now has a 1 in 5 chance of the Fed hiking as soon as next June, and perhaps hiking as much as 2.5, almost 3 times next year. I'm with you. I believe the Fed should have gotten off of zero a while ago. My guess is the politics aren't going to allow them to actually do what they're supposed to do for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is we've inflated asset prices. Household exposure to equity has never been higher. Do you think the Fed will raise rates regardless of who's running it? Do you think the Fed will raise rates next year if the inflation data warrant it, or will they punt and try to push off transitory a bit longer? Because even if we're come down even from 6 to 4, let's say, you'd still say inflation's coming down.
I don't see any, at the moment, I don't see any chance inflation's coming down at all.
Not even in the back half of the year. So you would say Yellen
back half of
next year.
Well, we'll see.
Right.
We're in November, and there's been no monetary restraint whatsoever. In fact, you could argue the money supply is picking up. The balance sheet continues to grow. I'm looking at the market indicators now. What do we see? The 5-year break-evens have broken up through 3%. That's a big move from a year ago. We've always had the commodity indicator, but now I notice gold is starting to move again. So I think the outlook for inflation is very high, and the Fed will be forced to curtail their QE, taper faster, and then raise rates sooner. That's going to happen. Look, they always, I started my career in open market operations at the New York Fed in 1973. I've been watching.
I heard the Fed. I think they were incorporated today back in 1914, but it wasn't that long ago.
They will always be forced to do what they don't want to do. Okay, that's the nature of the institution. So the world will be screaming about inflation. And it doesn't, whatever the White House says, it doesn't matter. The White House has no standing right now. Biden's polls are in the 30s. So even Yellen will go along with it. And I don't care who is it, whether it's Jay Powell or whether it's Lael Brainerd. It won't be Omarova. She's not going to make it. But
that's the, for those that don't know, she is being proposed for the comptroller of the currency.
That was a snarky joke, but actually she's going to be in testimony on Thursday. She's the Moscow State University controller. But yeah, you're going to have a problem next year. Rates are going to go up. Now, however, that's not going to stop the economy. You got to play this out.
Yeah.
The economy will rise as rates rise. In fact, people will try to beat the rate hikes
by bringing activity forward.
Activity, whether it's consumption or particularly business spending. So next year could be a boom-like year, even though the tax rates may go up. I don't know that they will, but I just think that the story has turned out, unfortunately, from V-shaped recovery with virtually no inflation. Now we have a strong recovery with great profits to help the stock market, but the inflation is getting out of hand. I mean, look, I was hoping, 6 months ago, 4 months ago, we would stop these bottlenecks and so forth. But the more I look at the Fed's balance sheet, I say, nah, doesn't matter. It's old-fashioned monetary-induced inflation, and there's nothing they can do about it except tighten the screws, and they're going to have to do that. So that sets up a lousy 23, late 22, I don't know, but not yet.
Our friend Jared Bernstein.
Yes.
Calls. And Jared is.
I love him.
Jared is just, Larry is really just very good friends great friends on both sides of the aisle. So Jared was on our show, your show a lot. I was on with Jared a lot. We debated. And Jared is one of the members of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jared calls you and says, Larry, I want you to come to the White House. I want you to meet the president. We want to talk about how we fix supply chain disruptions, because clearly it's a problem. What would you advise to him? Is it fixable? What would you say?
Well, I think on that, the only thing they can really do is deregulate the ports and try to deregulate the labor rules. I mean, the two biggest issues, and it's funny, it's a West Coast problem, it's not an East Coast problem. Ports of New York and Baltimore, and their big ports, have done fine. Even Georgia, too, is a big port. They've done very well. So it's Long Beach and LA. So you had two problems. Number one, the local port authorities did not keep the ports open 24/7. And one reason for that was the Longshoremen's Union wouldn't work past 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this information came out over time. I had heard about it a long time ago from friends of mine on the West Coast. So you got to fix that. Now, it is not yet fixed.
Yeah, no, the data actually is getting worse in terms of the delays and the bottlenecks.
So I read. And the longshoremen have not changed their work rules, and they're resisting it. God help us if there's a strike. That would make it 10 times worse. So that's the only really thing they can do. Look, that's...
Got to just wait. It's a waiting game.
Wait it out.
Yeah.
But the important thing here is, look, prices of domestic goods and services are going up. Stuff that has nothing to do with containers in the port of Long Beach. All prices are rising. The distribution is rising. That's a tip-off.
That it's going to last.
I think so.
Larry, you were talking about, and I've heard you mention this many, many times, and just seen in the Natixis French organization, very big in the ESG space, but the French also use a lot of nuclear power.
Yes.
These stage 4 or 5.
The French are smart. They're smarter than we are.
And I've heard you say, you could have the renewables, but you needed an efficient, inexpensive energy resource. Energy independence is so important for U.S. manufacturing, high value-added jobs. In your position when you were at NEC, what was why didn't we do more on the nuclear side? Because it seems like it's a no-brainer.
Well, the president was fine with nuclear. The issues there were more private sector development, where old reactors cannot be replaced. They're too expensive. And after the scare of Japan,
Fukushima,
and other places, you had a pullback. This was mostly during the Obama years, but I don't want to blame Obama because there was a pullback around the world. I'll just say we were urging the development of these new, module, smaller nuclear facilities. But the door was wide open, no regulatory barriers whatsoever. So that would have been good. I think the current administration does not like nuclear, so they will slow that down. We had NEPA rules, National Environmental Policy Rules, to reduce the lead times for all these projects, whether it was nuclear or gas pipelines, everything. And those were, under 2 years. So that was a very important thing. And it would have developed over time. But look, here's the thing about it. I just want to step back. The energy, try to make this uncomplicated. You're sitting here with the world's economy reopening. I won't say post-pandemic, but the worst of it's over. Businesses reopen. In the United States, I don't know, 85, 90% of business reopen. Probably true in most of the developed countries. Look, you want to have a post-pandemic global prosperity, okay? You must promote as much energy as possible. You can't grow without energy. You can't just say our base load energy is going to be cut back because we're worried about climate change and therefore we're going to stop oil, gas, coal, etc. You can't do that.
You need to make the transition.
Look, you have to allow the private sector innovation and technologies. I mean, let's take natural gas and fracking and horizontal drilling. What these guys did, Harold Hamm and these guys did 10, 12 years ago, they took an old technology, fracking, and reinvented it, innovated it, and applied it, and then all of a sudden, we were awash in oil and gas. All of a sudden. And it had nothing to do with government policy. They just did it, which is great. My problem with what the Biden administration is doing in Glasgow and all this stuff is they are trying to stop progress. Don't do it. Let these energies sort themselves out. You will have clean burning natural gas, and that will get better and better. You will have a certain amount of hydro, fusion, and nuclear. Essentially, gas and nuke is the future. Now, I'm all in favor of wind turbines. I'm all in favor of solar panels, believe me, all the above. But the stupidity of any of these countries to say in 10 years, no more this, no more that, then what you're saying is no more GDP, no more jobs, no more wages. All right? That's what you're saying. And it's crazy. And it's not necessary because the climate change data, when you actually look at the in the UN reports, not what the media reports, but the actual numbers, you know, off of this year 1900 base, we're doing very well.
And in the U.S. Or globally?
The U.S. is the best. I mean, we have our emissions have come down. We basically made the Paris Climate Accord targets 5 years early. And yes, we are among the lowest. I think we are the lowest.
Yeah, one of them.
So my point is, this panic is not verified by facts, statistics. We are not ruining the world economy. People are not dying. All this stuff is just dead wrong. And some important scientists have made this out. And you have this mass hysteria. It's one of the worst things, one of the most disappointing things. And fueled, I must be critical of the Biden administration, fueled by people who are smart enough to know better. But I mean, we on our show, and I had these people in the White House, physicists like Steve Koonin, Bjorn Lorborg. Look at the UN reports. They're saying worst case, in the next 100 years, the temperatures will go up 2 or 3 Celsius. Worst case. Well, you go through and try to figure out the economic consequences of that. They're very small. They're very small.
Yeah.
This hysteria is unwarranted. This idea that people are dying. The fact of the matter is, this is one of my favorite topics. People are dying because of climate. No, they're not. In fact, deaths from malnutrition, which is what they're talking about, have plunged.
Yeah, even Steven Pinker at Harvard has mentioned that.
Nordhaus from Yale, Nobel Prize winner. I mean, I'm saying people who are not crazy but actually look at the empirics And you know why the malnutrition has come down? Because of world growth.
Right.
Now, you can't stop world growth by stopping energy sources. It's the dumbest thing I ever heard. It's the dumbest. So this is probably my big. Now, here's the good news, Joe. The good news is they had the 26th climate summit and nothing happened. You know, nothing happened. And China, I don't know what the readout is from the Xi-Biden meeting last night, virtual meeting. We'll find out before the day's over, and we're going to talk about it on the show tonight. But we made John Kerry. Don't get me started.
I got you. You're on a roll. I didn't realize that.
But he actually is. I don't know whether he's not allowing it, but China says we're going to produce coal.
Right.
And India says we're going to produce coal. Now, coal's not my favorite. Don't get me wrong, but it just shows how little was done.
Well, I was going to ask you this.
Almost nothing was done.
I want to segue from the.
Lovey, can I have another cup of coffee as we get warmed up here? Somebody, thanks.
I want to segue from one of the last questions I want to ask before I open it up to Jean-François. I want to ask you, it was the segue from the climate issues, or rather the energy issues of China.
Two things. Let me go macro, just macro.
Sure.
All right. Here's what we got. In the United States, we have a policy that would raise taxes and cut energy. And the G7 and G20 kind of went along with that. I mean, you have global tax hike coming. It's crazy. It's the nuttiest thing I've ever seen.
On the global minimum tax?
Yes. It's the stupidest thing I've ever seen.
Will that be passed by Congress? I'm sorry.
No, it will not.
Okay.
But in any case, I had very good relations with Minister Bruno Le Maire, who was a friend and a very smart man. But on this issue, we disagreed, the global minimum tax. What you need for growth, post-pandemic growth, globally, okay, Europe, Asia, Americas, Sub-Saharan, you need lower taxes and more energy.
Yeah.
You follow me?
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite of what they're trying to do. And this, I don't think it will be implemented, but I'm just saying it's theoretically and practically wrong. I don't want to stop corporate profits. I want them to make more money to hire more people with better wages and equipment. But if you're going to tax them and raise their marginal rate, their minimum rate, which means no more expensing for equipment, that's crazy.
Well, energy investment's down about 50%
Absolutely.
from its peak.
Absolutely.
So China is burning a lot of coal as they're supposedly building these nuclear reactors.
Thank you.
Last question I want to ask before I turn it over.
Are they getting, I mean, is China moving to nuclear?
Well, that's supposedly they're building, they're using their coal because they need the energy source for the growth, and ultimately transition to nuclear. China is certainly a big issue geopolitically. I'm going to ask a broad question. What worries you most about China? One of the things I know that your friend, Secretary Wilbur Ross of Commerce, was worried about potential China getting involved militarily with Taiwan, and semiconductor capacity is so big there. Does China keep you up at night? Is this just saber rattling in the press? What should we be watching, or what are you worried about with respect to U.S.-China relations?
Well, I think, you have many problems with the relationship. We had, before the pandemic came crashing down, we had just completed, after 2 long years, I was very involved in this, the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal. And relations were pretty good. Pretty good. And it was a path-breaking deal. Then came the pandemic and all the issues tied up with Wuhan and China's lack of transparency, which to this day has not been solved. So that's a big problem. Secondly, Xi Jinping has become very aggressive extremely aggressive. You know, we saw first with Hong Kong and now Taiwan, and he's publicly making these inflammatory statements. He's cleaning house in the CCP, so he's got all his people in place. My very dear friend, Liu He, who was the lead economic trade negotiator, has lost most of his power. In economics, Joe, the free market people have lost influence, and the state control people have gained influence. And so their economic outlook will suffer because of that. They're allocating credit primarily to the state-owned enterprises and keeping it away from the entrepreneurial private sector. I'm not saying 100%, I'm saying at the margin, there's much greater state control of credit and everything else. There's much greater state control of freedom, speech, and so forth, all the big social media issues. I mean, they're ripping apart public offerings. These companies, and this is another issue which we worked on, the NEC led with O'Brien at the NSC, as when you were there the last year, their public offerings were completely non-transparent. They didn't meet international standards. But more than that, the Chinese government has made them instrumentalities of the government because they can pull out information anytime. And that's very bad. So those relations have suffered. The Taiwan problem is bad. China is also making very aggressive moves in Latin America and South America. You have a couple of governments. You've had Cuba, of course, and Venezuela. Now Nicaragua's gone officially communist, but they're infiltrating. They're using the old Belt and Road stuff to infiltrate in Brazil, for example, which is a very important country, as you know. So the relations are not good. China will be very active in Afghanistan. They've already come in there. Our withdrawal was a catastrophe, in my judgment. And I don't know how it's going to be sorted out. I don't know. I just don't know. The Biden people have had some good strong things to say, and some not so strong. So I don't know. It's very vexing, very, very vexing. You know, we were talking about this on the Fox Business Show last night for a while. Monica Crowley, who was a China expert before she came to the Treasury. Anyway, the thought that I had, and I talked to O'Brien, Robert O'Brien, our former national security, you know, Trump, like him or not, some liked him, some didn't like him, I understand. But Trump was strong and unpredictable. I mean, even during the trade negotiations, my favorite story was in the summer of 2019, he was impatient with the lack of progress on trade. And, you know, he'd make these early, I'd get a call at 7:30 in the morning, and he was saying to me, they're taking too long, I don't believe them, and I want to put another $200 billion in tariffs on. And I'm going to announce it today, and you're going out there to communicate it. And I would call Mnuchin, my dear friend at Treasury. He got the same call, and he said, and I said, how are we going to play this? And he would say to me, well, just go out there and just be flat, no emotion, just say it and give the reason, and that's that. And that's what we did. Now, my point is this. His unpredictability was a good thing. Keep him on the defensive. Biden doesn't. Biden's plain vanilla. It's not the
Crazy
same
like
strength.
a fox in some ways.
Reagan was the same way. You know, everybody used to, when I worked for Reagan a long time ago, so Reagan, they said, well, he's crazy guy, this cowboy from California, this Class B actor, all this stuff. He has his finger on the nuclear trigger. That was good. It scared the hell out of the old Soviets.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like the fact that Trump would say, even to our European allies. You got to pony up on NATO. Not leaving, but you got to pony up. Keep them off balance. So that's one thing we should do with China. I don't know if we're going to do that.
Right. Fascinating. Jean-François, I don't want to take all the time. I've got a lot more questions for Larry, but I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions that have come in, so it's all yours.
Yes, there are many questions and reactions to your discussion. Very interesting discussion on our side in Europe. There are lots of remarks on the green transition, which seems to be very much at the forefront of the agenda in Europe. Maybe one remark on my side, just to open the discussion as well. Since 1990, the CO2 emissions, the carbon emission in the world, were down 25%, while the growth, the GDP growth of the world increased by 60%. So here in Europe, we tend to think of the green transition as not to be opposed to GDP growth in a way. And we see that the green transition that we are accelerating in a way is going to be probably the way of the energy of the future and so on and so forth. Lots of discussion, lots of questions. But maybe just to follow up on your very, very interesting point, Larry, on the China and US relationship. Sorry, I'm French, so let me be a little bit brutal on this. Do you see a risk in the incoming years of a direct confrontation between the US and China, maybe over Taiwan, but do you see a risk of direct confrontation between US and China?
Well, it's a good question. It's a very difficult question. And I don't want to pretend that I know anything more than others know. If you ask me, is there a risk? Yes. If you ask how to rate the risk, like a country risk analysis, I would say to you, after the difficulty in Afghanistan, the CCP starts buzzing Taiwan airspace, identification zone airspace, 150 flights a day. That was no coincidence. That was unexpected, and it was a very hostile action, the most hostile action we've ever seen from them on Taiwan. And of course, as you know, this comes about a year after the Hong Kong takeover. So they've raised the ante. Chinese have raised the risk factor. And that's something that has to be looked at carefully and responded to. And I might say, the U.S. may take the lead, but I think the European countries, the leading countries in Europe, including France, have been very helpful regarding China. And this was one of the things that I did. I kind of had the European trade portfolio and the European political portfolio with O'Brien and Pompeo, but we worked hard with the great European democracies to help us on China. We need help, and I think there's good progress there. President Macron, I think, was very good, very, very strong. I knew Macron quite well. I admire him. He knows that. And also, I would add the former deputy NSC, Philippe Etienne, who's now the ambassador. So they were very helpful with us on China and helping to get Europe on board. But we all have to work on this. The democracies have got to work as unified as possible to stop Chinese aggression. That's the long and short of it.
Larry, maybe last question. Sorry again, the time is ticking up. It was a very dense interview. Maybe last question for you, Larry. Again, a little bit direct and abrupt. Do you think that President Trump is going to run for election in 2024?
I have seen him many. Had dinner with him 10 days ago in Mar-a-Lago. I don't know, and I would suggest to you he doesn't know. And he will be very active as a major force in the Republican Party and nationwide. His polls are very good right now. I don't think any of that becomes clear until after next November's midterm elections.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you, Joe, for joining us. And sorry for the technical interruption. It's very interesting because we can move on back to China with our great expert on China, Alicia. She's spending some time in Taiwan, so she can react to lots of subjects raised by Larry Kudlow. So maybe to continue on what Larry was saying. He was saying that maybe the solution for bottlenecks was to deregulate ports and to not to have too many problems with unions. I'm sure this is not an issue with Chinese ports in Shanghai, but still we had this bottleneck. So maybe the question, to follow up on the question we had just before the interruption, just after the interruption, after the zero COVID, maybe the question is China in a way is exporting due to this zero COVID policy? We have this bottleneck due to the zero COVID policy, because once you have 3 cases, you shut down a whole city, and then some ports, some very important cities for the supply chains. So do we see a risk of China exporting inflation to the rest of the world? The bottlenecks, are they due to what's happening in China now?
Yeah, indeed. I think China has long exported deflation. We tend to forget that part of the reason why the world got into that low inflation, stable inflation, even low, very low for some, too low inflation, was due to China basically smashing prices, to gain market share, global market share in trade. And that has changed for 2 reasons. One is exactly what you pointed out. So we had the port of Ningbo, which is basically the 2nd largest in the world, basically stopping working for a month or so because of a COVID case. So imagine, how that sounds in this part of the world. So we tend to forget that so far there's no such thing as trade without people-to-people movement. And this is whether it's air freight, whether it's shipping, and therefore China has part of the, it's part of the reason why we're having supply chain disruptions. China, Vietnam, I mean, major manufacturing centers, China being, of course, the largest. But beyond that, and that's the graph we have there, China is grappling with very high producer prices, as you know. So they're close to 14% latest data, with very stable inflation. So this could implicitly look like China is not creating consumer price inflation. But this is true only within China because the demand is very weak. However, when we look at certain export prices, which we have there for certain products, such as mobile phones, we show that, just imagine, in the 3rd quarter, that's where China starts exporting inflation big time, 3rd quarter, where China manages to kind of transfer part of that producer price increases, not domestically, because it's very difficult, there's no demand, but externally. So you have there that most of the export growth in China, which was humongous in the 3rd quarter, was all about prices. Even quantities for mobile phones actually get negative increase in volume, but massive increase in value, so prices. We see that in LCD panels, we see that in semiconductors. So basically China assembles semiconductors, doesn't really produce, but that production. So we tend to think that semiconductor prices are increasing because of China's demand, but part of that is China's supply, basically export prices increasing dramatically. So it is indeed a very important issue to me, because it means that once the source of deflation has become inflationary at the worst of all times, because that's where the world is grappling with inflation indeed.
And do you think it's something which is going to be temporary or in nature or a lasting phenomenon?
Okay, so as long as China can't create the demand needed to absorb those high upstream prices, they'll have to export them. Yeah? As long as the world is growing above potential, China will be able to export part of that price differential to the rest of the world. So it might last quite some time.
And we talk a lot about demand, as you said, the demand side on China. Is there any risk of what's going on? Evergrande is obviously on everyone's mind, but in terms of the bursting of this real estate bubble, I remember a paper by Rogoff saying that the real estate in China was not 10%, but in fact 30% of close to 30% of the Chinese GDP. If it's true, I don't know what's your view on that. Do you have some concern about this real estate bubble about to burst, but decided by the government?
So it's indeed, your last point was well taken. This is not a bubble bursting out of only excess. It's a managed bursting of a bubble, which is very different from our experiences in Europe, in my home country, in Spain. Nothing to do with that, because this is the government realizing that it's about time to rein in a bloated sector. Very different. Why do they want to rein in it? First, because as we see in the graph there, China household debt to GDP has ballooned. The affordability, housing affordability is increasingly difficult. And that goes against the CCP's, or actually President Xi's mantra of common prosperity. So China is getting into a different growth phase by which growth will be lower. We all know that. So they need to redistribute whatever is left much better. And the real estate sector is sitting in between that redistribution, actually complicating it. So by reining in the real estate sector, one obvious consequence is that housing prices, will grow much less. And it will be like a utility. And this also means, and we already see it in the figures, that housing-related fixed asset investment will be very low, if not negative already. And that will be a major slowing down effect for growth. But China is ready to pay that price, because continuing to increase a sector that isn't really profitable, if you see. China is wanting to move up the ladder. It's building houses that...
Yes, that was my point, because if you want to put some decline in the real estate prices, the solution is probably more supply, not less supply. So probably you push the same thing with China that it used to be, that you are leveraging again a little bit the company. Is it any risk to see kicking the can down the road in a sense, because you are going to do more supply of real estate, and then you are just weighting again your Chinese economy more towards real estate? No.
They don't want more supply, first because it's again putting too much burden of growth on a sector they don't want to push any further, because it's not productive. It's not, and I think that's one of the reasons. And second, it's already a big problem, because there's a huge oversupply already. The demand was coming for investment purposes. We can't forget that Chinese can't invest everywhere. Yeah, they have a rather close capital account. Thus, it was a source of investment or a speculative investment rather than just, a need. And I think that was something that the government wanted to stop. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Larry raised a few points on the climate. I think it's very opposite to the European view in a way.
Yeah.
Is it in opposition to China? My question is the following. In fact, what we have seen following the COP26 is that China and the US were kind of improving their coordination in the green transition. Can we see a risk, or not a risk, an opportunity, in fact, for the planet, to see this kind of a competition between US and China toward greener energy? Is it something serious, this greenification of China?
I wish they had that competition. It doesn't seem to me, after what we heard and actually what we read about Glasgow. I think their competition is how to hide in the shadows of that seemingly relevant competition, if you see what I mean. So in a nutshell, I think China is serious about energy transition, but at its own pace. And China's industrial policy is more important, so they probably hear, they have Larry as consultant. I'm kidding now, but they realize that industrial policy is important. What I mean to say is that they believe in solar panels. They have 80% of global production, let's face it, but they don't use them. They still have, 60% of electricity produced by coal. And what do they do with these solar panels? They export them, sometimes at a loss. Why? Because
we call it dumping, no?
They call it dumping, but they call it infant industry strategy on the export market. And why they do that? Because it's very similar to vaccines. Is they want to first become front runners, and also on the technology to kind of capture that market. And only when that's done, they will, of course, slowly but steadily, and at a better price, by the way, substitute their coal for greener energy. And they won't do that before it's time. So I think that's basically why their reduction of emissions happens mainly after 2025. So they first do the industrial policy part, and then they sell what others need, and then they use what others might no longer need as much. So it's a very timely way to fight climate change.
There's an interesting question beyond the real estate, not bubble. We said it's more something decided by the government. Do you see any big risk for China beyond Evergrande? What is a big risk for the financial system in China? There's a question on that.
Evergrande is a real economy risk. I don't think it's a financial risk because banks are hardly exposed. It's 1.6% of total loans are loans to developers. The developers' main funding comes from pre-sales. So basically it's households' risk. So it's a real economy risk. But that doesn't mean that the financial sector has no risk. It's a very complex model. It's a matryoshka model, what I call a matryoshka model. So you open a doll and you find another doll and another doll. So it's kind of a very strange leverage model by which you really don't know where the ultimate risk is. And the capital is minimal, especially in commercial, so city commercial banks, joint stock commercial banks, i.e. not the largest state-owned banks. I think those banks will run into trouble, especially the smallest banks. Also because they're supported by local governments, and local governments are feeling the pinch of not being able to sell the land to those developers that no longer want to build. And that's a big issue. So yes, there is obvious financial risk in China. And just to end, there's another risk, which is defaults. Not so much the real estate sector, although we've seen some defaults clearly on the smaller end of the developers, but the manufacturing sector, because they are being squeezed, especially downstream, so end consumer, by very high upstream prices, which they need to absorb, and the demand not being able to accept higher prices, and the energy crisis and electricity rationing. So their situation is pretty
So you
difficult.
see what we see is a big widening of spread of IG and high yield spread in credit in China is there for a reason. Maybe last question, maybe to circle in with what Larry was saying. Do you see any risk of this confrontation between US and China? Where are we going? Is it a new Cold War?
Well, I kind of agree that the Biden administration has first looked very much like the Trump one at the very beginning, so there wasn't any change in tone. It was very aggressive. I think there's been a new phase of what I call a de-risking phase, but that's not because Biden wants to be nicer to China. In my opinion, it's because Biden is weak, to be very frank. And Taiwan comes at the forefront of that weakness, meaning post-Afghanistan, I think the US needs to take time to understand what to do with Taiwan. Taiwan is not Afghanistan. Taiwan is the largest producer of semiconductors in the world, let's face it.
That's a good reason to invade it, no?
But it's a good reason to avoid it, which is basically something that wasn't there in Afghanistan. And finally, there's another reason, is that if the Biden administration shows its weaknesses on Taiwan, its major allies in the region, i.e. Japan and Australia, will run away. So, you know, Taiwan is the window shop for the US in Asia. And I think that's something that requires de-risking, because you need to breathe and think what I'm going to do in front of this risk. So it is a very tense situation. It's not, I don't think it's an immediate risk of invasion, because China has the other opposing risk. Who is behind the US? Japan, Australia, Europe, the US. I mean, that's, will they? So it is, I think, kind of a, for me, Taiwan is the best sign of a world that is entering a Cold War, if you ask me. That's what it is.
Maybe last question to finish with China and to move to Europe. If you had to take a guess, what will be the GDP growth in China 5 years from now?
Wow, it's going to be low. And it's going to be low because most of what we see in China...
In the twos or in the threes?
In the threes. In the threes, but China is not ready to grow 3% because its population has been used to pretty high growth in disposable income, as much as 10% for quite a few years since 2010, and it was only 5.5% last year, so it's half. And if you grow 3, it's going to be 3. So, you know, like...
Kind of a middle income trap at Chinese style.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I suggest we move to Europe. As usual, do not hesitate to raise some questions that we try to answer during the discussion. So maybe starting with Dirk Schumacher, or chief economist for Europe. What we see is a kind of a catching up of Europe. It was slow start with the COVID. We see that lots of nice numbers. I'm thinking of France, probably close to 7% of GDP growth this year. We expect France to be at 4.4 next year. So to kind of forget about the COVID-19 in terms of GDP growth, and we'll be back to pre-COVID level at the end of this year, basically around Europe. But we see a slowing down in Europe as well. Is it only due to bottleneck, industrial, like Germany in trouble, sorry, with its automobile sector, or is it temporary? What do you think of that?
I think it's predominantly those by now famous bottlenecks, and there are many of these. I mean, the semiconductors are just one of it, but obviously very important one, the one that hits the car industry in particular hard, which in Germany is very important, and that explains the relative underperformance of Germany at this point. Other countries with a smaller manufacturing sector are less impacted by that. Though, if you look at that chart we're just showing, you can see that Italy is doing very well, which is interesting. So there are many stories, if you will, to be told on the country level, but it's clear that every country is negatively impacted by those bottlenecks. Are these temporary? I hope so. I mean, there are good reasons to believe that the market reacts. There will be more investment, and all these bottlenecks eventually will evade. But when exactly is hard to say. The fundamental picture remains pretty sound, nevertheless. So once they are out of the picture, those bottlenecks, we expect the economy to resume growth in a more significant way. I have to mention, though, unfortunately, COVID here in this context as well, because in some countries...
Let's not forget it, yes. It's not off.
No, in particular in German-speaking countries, the numbers look pretty ugly. So at least in our base case, we don't expect any lockdown, but the one thing we have learned during this crisis is don't rule out anything. So that's yet another risk factor, but again, not in part of our baseline model here. We really focus at bottlenecks at this point, which will probably be dampening growth until the beginning of next year, and then they get smaller, we hope.
And we talk a lot about these bottlenecks, probably temporary by nature. We'll talk about the energy with Joel just after. How do you see inflation navigating this troubled waters, where you see some big spike of inflation due mostly to bottleneck, to energy, and so on and so forth? Do you see ECB following the Fed into a quick tapering, into some kind of preparing the market for a rate hike? Do you see anything coming from the ECB?
No, I mean, the message from the ECB is pretty clear. At least the board, the president, they don't don't want to follow the Fed. They think the underlying picture is a different one, and we tend to agree. Cyclically, the US is far more advanced. The risk of overheating that we heard earlier from Larry Kudlow is much more significant in the US because the fiscal impulse is bigger. Again, it's more advanced in the cycle. So I would buy the story coming from the ECB that the increase is temporary, and therefore there is no need to fundamentally change the course of monetary policy at this stage. Now, that forecast can be wrong. We'll find out over the next 6 months whether that's indeed true.
Where do you see inflation at the end of next year, for instance?
Well, we have it falling below 2% by the middle of the year and then back to 1.5% by the end of the year. Important to note that
strong basis effect.
Yeah, and half of the increase we've seen currently, around more than 4% is the headline inflation, but more than half of that is coming from the energy sector. And that will fall out of the equation eventually, and then inflation will look differently. We have also from the German VAT hike from last year, a base effect that will kick in at the beginning of next year. So there are good reasons to believe that indeed these are temporary shocks that eventually will fade out, and then the inflation picture will normalize. Now, the ECB is not going to ease policy any further. So on average, it's going to be more tighter. The PEP, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, will run out in March, we think. It will not be replaced with another big program. The smaller APP program will continue. So monetary policy won't be as accommodative as it had been, but compared to other central banks, say the Bank of England or the Fed, the ECB will clearly lag in terms of tightening policy.
Do you see any risk December 16 meeting of the ECB to see any surprise regarding the TLTRO?
I think that's a low temperature issue in a sense that it's not as politically charged as QE. Most people in the Governing Council would agree that's a good thing to have. On the one hand, I think the ECB wants to wean off banks from funding from the ECB eventually, but it also wants to prevent any cliff edge problem. So I'm not sure they're going to announce already in December what they're going to do. They're probably going to announce something, maybe that they will announce at a later point in time. And they have time. It's not really the pressing issue. Again, they're trying to square here, getting banks less used to funding from the ECB. At the same time, be sure there's not a problem in terms of funding. And they will manage that, I think.
We expect as well the ECB to publish its 2024 forecast for inflation. Where do you see it? Is it a confirmation that the ECB will take its time to normalize its monetary policy?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the message. I mean, it's a staff projection, if you will. It's objective. It's driven by models plus some.
You participated on that a few years ago, so you know it works.
Yeah, it's a convoluted process, of course, but the message is clear. I mean, if they show number 2 point something by the end of the forecast horizon, that's a pretty hawkish signal. I don't think they will send that. I think they will show inflation still below 2%.
We talk a lot, Larry was talking about excess spending by the Biden administration. Clearly, we were comparing that to Europe to say that Europe was doing very little compared to the US. But at the end of the day, when we compare the actual plan in the US to European, the balance is probably a little bit more, not in favor of Europe, but clearly more balanced in a way. We compare that to kind of a Marshall Plan for Europe. If we compare the GDP numbers to Europe, while in the US, at the end of the day, the Biden plan is only something around 500 billion of excess spending. This 1.2 trillion, in fact, it's only new of 500 billion. While in Europe, we see this first federalist approach in a way coming. How do you look into that? Is it a really game changer going forward?
I mean, for one, it shows that Europe can act if needed. So there has been obviously a lot of resistance, again, from German-speaking countries, to do that, but it was now viewed as necessary, and then the important people were willing to jump over that fence and say, yeah, we're willing to take on risk in a significant or socialized risk, if you will, among the countries, and agree to big transfers. Now, the big question, is that a one-off? My guess would be, at least for the time being, now it comes down to how is that money spent? Is it spent in a way that you can make the argument, look, this has worked, we should make that permanent or not? So that will be really crucial. But even then, it's not a given that this will be the stepping stone for further fiscal integration. And what the new German government is up to, obviously, will also be important in that respect, which at this stage is still uncertain. But the important point is Europe, as usual, it takes some time, but then it can move and do the right thing eventually. In terms of the growth impact, it's probably it's nice to have. It's spread out over many years, and we've incorporated it in our forecasts. But it's smaller, as you said, than what's happening in the US. But nonetheless, it helps. It's in addition to a very accommodative monetary policy, supporting growth and triggering reforms in countries who need that. So I'm quite optimistic in the end that this is a good thing.
And to finish with, maybe what is our forecast for next year GDP for Europe?
Well, we have close to 5% for next year. We have weakness at the beginning of the year, but then pick up in growth quite significant, in particular in Germany, which has been lagging now. So it's solid growth. We won't catch up necessarily to the US. Well, actually, Joe is quite pessimistic, so we might actually catch up to the US. But trend growth in Europe is smaller. We know that it will stay smaller. So given these circumstances, Europe will be fine.
Okay, maybe it's time to talk about energy prices, because I guess if we have too high energy prices, it means that the ECB has no choice but to normalize quicker than you suggest, Dirk. Obviously, you see that with Natixis, our view is that for the ECB to be gently removing its accommodation in a very slow motion way. Joel is our energy expert within Natixis Research. Like I said, a top 3 forecaster for nat gas. So I cannot but ask you about natural gas. But maybe first thing first, how do you explain this tremendous rally on energy prices of late?
Yeah, so if we start with natural gas, the key thing to note about the gas market is that it essentially runs on flexibility. So demand can vary so much between seasons and even between different days within a season, that flexibility is embedded on the supply side with the ability to flex supply contracts, and also on the demand side with the ability to switch fuels. But what we've noted through 2021 is a consistent inability to utilize that flexibility. So if you think back to last winter, it was very cold and actually extended beyond the typical period. So we had a very cold April. So that resulted in the market entering the summer, with a lot less gas in inventory than would be typical. Now, through this summer, typically what we'd expect to see is the market using that flexibility to normalize the inventory level. But as mentioned, that flexibility essentially failed. So we've seen basically inventory struggle to rebuild. Now, on the supply side, that's been down to very, very strong LNG markets globally. Also, Norwegian supply has been impacted by kind of very high maintenance that was deferred from 2020 due to the pandemic. Also, some kind of geopolitical things going on with Nord Stream 2 and Russian flows. On the demand side, coal markets have been very strong as well, so that's limited switching. So essentially, we've entered the winter with this deficit being maintained, and now the market's having to price for kind of marginal demand destruction in the industrial segment. So big kind of industrial users of natural gas, so fertilizers, chemicals, refiners, have been incentivized to either cut off supply or switch fuels.
And we are during the COP26 that, that's again a discussion we shall have with Larry Kudlow on energy sources. But clearly oil is now in COP26 seen as a broad thing, and which is stating the obvious. But what about oil prices in this context? We see rising demand while we should see decreasing demand if we need to do some green transition. What about the oil prices in this context?
Yeah, so oil is really interesting because essentially we've normalized demand in 2021. So widespread vaccination has allowed this kind of artificial mobility restriction that was limiting consumption. I mean, oil is a transportation fuel. People need to move to consume oil. So that's allowed demand to normalize. Now in 2022, we need supply to normalize and beyond, I might add. So we expect OPEC's spare capacity to be normalized and exhausted next year. And then we're going to see a call on non-OPEC supply. Now, the US has constituted the vast majority of non-OPEC supply growth since around 2013, 2014. And we can even say that US supply has crowded out investment in more conventional resource themes. But what we're seeing and what we've seen through 2021 is a much lower reactivity to high oil prices from the US tight oil sector. So this is predominantly due to investors demanding capital discipline. So reinvestment rates, so capex over.
So do you mean some kind of underinvestment in oil in the US of late?
Yes, definitely. You can see on the chart there the kind of historic relationship between rigs and oil prices has been completely, well, we've kind of moved past that relationship. Now investors have been demanding reinvestment rates be kept relatively low. So over the past 5 years, reinvestment rates have averaged over 100%. The last quarter's data was just 45%. Now this has significant implications for oil prices really, because if we consider US tight oil to be kind of the marginal supply in the oil market, now we're having to pay more for that supply because we have to incorporate that investor return.
And two questions on oil. One, do you see oil reaching $100 a barrel? And the second question, where do you see oil prices 10 years from now?
Wow, okay, I'll take the first one.
I take note.
So in terms of $100 per barrel, what we're seeing at the moment, and part of the rally over the past month or so, has been due to the switch in dynamic we're seeing between natural gas and oil. So on an oil equivalent basis, natural gas is trading about $150 per barrel. Front month Brent is 82, quite high, but not 150, right? So if you can switch between natural gas and oil, you are, and that's leading to some additional consumption. Now we estimate that's around 0.3 to 0.4 million barrels per day. But if you get a cold winter, then that switch in dynamic is going to get deeper essentially. So we think oil is trading a bit like a seasonal commodity, and it will be more sensitive to the weather dynamics. So if we do have a cold winter, then $100 per barrel is relatively likely. If the winter is more average, then kind of around the current level is our forecast.
So if we have a warmer world, I guess in 10 years from now, your oil prices will be much lower, no?
Well, the issue is that global warming leads to more extremity in weather, so we might see colder winter.
You're right.
And more price fights. In terms of the longer term outlook, if we look at the coal market, we've seen a plateau in terms of consumption. We might see a similar thing with oil. If we're not able to invest in oil due to kind of ESG metrics, things like that, then it's likely that we see higher oil prices going forwards.
Thank you, Joe. And in terms of natural gas prices, so maybe the last question, do you see that so lasting for a while, these high natural gas prices?
The issue with natural gas in Europe is that domestic production has declined quite significantly over the past 2 or 3 years, and it's been a trend that's been in play for a while. Now that's been masked by very, very loose global LNG markets. Essentially, we saw a lot of projects sanctioning after the Fukushima disaster, and that supply came online in 2017, 2018, 2019. Now that excess supply essentially landed in Europe and depressed gas prices. Now from 2016 and 2017, we saw a slowdown in sanctioning of LNG projects. Now typically we see a 5-year cycle from FID to first gas. So that tightening is now underway, and we're seeing much less gas entering the market. 2021, 2022 and 2023. So because Europe is now more reliant on imports, we have to compete for those imports. Now that cyclically tightening LNG market should bias European gas prices higher.
So there's a strong case for renewable or nuclear energy, like we discussed before. Thank you very much, Joel, Alicia, and Dirk. I suggest we move to the next workshop on more market element of the discussion. So to sum up in a way, we can say that our view within Natixis, I think we had this discussion with Larry, very enlightening to see that there is lots of debate still going on within the US, but as well between Europe and the US. So to summarize a little bit our view on this, once again, we see a big slowing down of US economy going into next year. Despite this big Biden spending, we see the net effect of that to be quite limited. We see the monetary policy in the US, this tapering to dent a little bit GDP growth. And if inflation is a little bit long-lasting in the US, more than we thought initially. Clearly, it's going to dent as well on the purchasing power of the US households. So for this reason, we expect the GDP growth to be half of what it was in 2021, in 2022. Alicia said it all on China. We expect Chinese GDP growth to be around 5%. But when it comes to Europe, you can see that that's a striking figure. In fact, that Europe is going to do the same GDP growth, enjoy the same GDP growth still next year compared to the Chinese economy, and twice as much as the US economy. So Europe, we are still very much in this V-shaped part of the recovery in Europe going into next year, but still the ECB, Dirk said it, is going to be very gentle compared to the US. We still have this kind of a big time lag between the ECB and the Fed. So maybe moving to the market with my two colleagues here. So Cyril Regna is heading the research, the market research within Natixis, and Florent Pochon, who is our senior analyst on cross-asset topics within the research. So thank you both for joining me. So maybe starting with Cyril, because we see that the bond market is clearly causing the move, that's moving the tail of the market probably. So what do you say about market, the bond market? Is it the end of negative rates? Is it the end of this decade-long bull market for bonds?
Not really. First statement I think we have to make is that the current pricing of rate hike expectations across the globe is very excessive. But at the same time, we just can't blame markets having this kind of expectations. Looking at inflation numbers we just got last week in the US, or in the context in which many central bankers have been announcing tapering or, of course, have been hiking rates. We are definitely bullish, of course, but we are seeing supporting factors such as this drop in inflation figures Dirk was mentioning before, and this drop is going to be quite sizable next year, notably in the US, where we'll touch something like 7% by the end of the year, and we'll see maybe 2% next year. So sizable drop, and in this regard, it's a good support. So bearish, yes, but nothing that big, even in the US, and despite the announcements we're going to have, of course, in the coming weeks.
And how do you see the yield curve behaving in this context? Because we have seen a lot of questions around stagflation on one side, inflation, wage price spiral on the other side. How do you see the yield curve behaving, the shape of the yield curve? Is it bear flattening? Is it steepening? How do you see that?
Well, first thing to say is that as long as you have rate hike expectations, which are very excessive at the time being, and which are going to be lower according to us tomorrow, let's say, it means that the front end of your yield curve would be much well anchored than before. So any bearish configuration would probably translate into more steepening pressures, notably on the 210s. Of course, on 1030s, it's a bit different story. It depends on the risk appetite of real money investors. And next year, they're going to have a much more price power, let's say, or a bigger impact given the shift we're going to have in the US with the Fed, with its tapering, but same in Europe with the ECB, which going to buy less, of course. So 1030s is a bit special, but steepening probably will be the name of the game next year.
And in terms of target for Bund or T-notes, so where do we see the yield going into end of next year for the Bund and the Treasury, for instance?
Definitely higher than current levels, which are too low, but this being due to probably...
So the short term is too high and the long term is too low, if I understand well.
Yeah, notably on swaps, but on cash, it's probably more simple. on cash, everything has to be higher than current level. Bonds, 10-year bonds, by the end of next year is going to be around 40 basis points. So
end of negative rates in Europe?
Yeah, not for the front end, unfortunately. While in the meantime, 10-year USTs should suffer a bit as well, but we see the equilibrium around 2% for the 10-year tenor.
We see the market very much concerned about central banks and testing a little bit the forward guidance of central banks. Like you said, and in the US, I think last time I checked, we had something around 60 basis points of rate hike as soon as next year in the US, while the central bank is saying, well, calm down. Same for the ECB, saying no rate hikes next year, while the market is pricing in something. Apart from central bank, do you see any big risk for the bond market in 2022?
Definitely, and notably in Europe, the political calendar is going to be pretty challenging, starting in January, where we're going to have some elections in Portugal, in Italy. Of course, a big thing will be the French presidential in April next year. It's going to have an impact, of course, on spread and on the appetite for French OATs. And we do expect some widening of spread at some points. But thankfully, I think probably real money investors in Europe are eager for higher yields. The reason why we do expect them to, let's say, buy more bonds during this sell-off. And as most of them will anyway expect, let's say, a good news in France when it comes to the next president, it's likely we're going to see heavy buyers of French OATs just before the elections and afterwards as well.
Yes, probably the political landscape in France is a little bit less risky in a sense that we don't see for now what we have seen in 2016, where at some stage we had two anti-euro candidates leading the polls for the second run. Definitely for now it's not the case, much less the case, and even the extreme candidates are in a way not anti-euro, or at least they don't say openly that they want to exit the euro. So it's probably a more comfortable political landscape. So if we translate that into a sovereign spread, how do you expect that to play out in sovereign spread going forward?
10-year OATs bonds up to, let's say, 65 basis points as a high point around March of next year, and then a retightening towards something closer to 40 BPs, so between 35 and 40, which according to us is a current equilibrium for these spreads. While on BTPs, it's going to be pretty, I think, more challenging, notably during the second half of next year, because keep in mind that we're going to have general elections in 2023 in Italy, and we know that usually it's a reason of stress. It's fueling stress, and in this regard, market positioning on BTPs is still very long, and we would expect BTPs to underperform in this kind of context.
Thank you, Cyril. And what we're saying basically is that we see some stress, but less for France than during 2017, where the peak in March was around above 80, I think, at the time. So a little bit less than that. But clearly, what we have next year, that will be the name of the game of next year, probably, is that we see central banks tapering, so reducing their monetary provision. So when we say less QE, we say more volatility by definition in a way, so probably a bit of wider spread, a bit of change in asset allocation. So maybe the next question is for you, Florent. What do you make out of what's just been said for your asset allocation in 2022, Florent?
Obviously, we always think that things will get a little bit choppier the year we don't know. So as you mentioned at the beginning,
that's called future.
That said, in the house scenario that we described, which is a soft landing, decreasing inflation, and central bank which remain pretty accommodative, we still believe that we have to remain constructive on equity markets. So we still believe that the equity markets will be, let's say, one of the winning asset class for next year. And again, the reasons for that are threefold. The first one is that central banks will remain pretty accommodative. So as long as inflation risk does not kill the central bank puts, it's going to be good, and we're going to continue to have real rates that are extremely low or negative at the front end, as Cyril mentioned. Second, the TINA remains true, which means that we are not super bearish on bonds, but still we don't like duration risk, at least for the first part of the year. So expected returns for fixed income remain really weak. And third, if you look at corporate sector, it remains super resilient. So many people, including us, were pretty worried in Q3 in terms of earnings result, and we've been pretty well surprised with, again, 80% of positive surprise in terms of earnings for the S&P. We have 60% of positive surprise for Euro stocks. We have average surprise, which are somehow around 10%, and we have still super high margins with profit margins that continue to increase and have not decreased despite all the worry we have on the supply side. So this remains really the key forces that make us believe that equity markets will remain resilient. That said, more volatility, as you mentioned, because again, more uncertainty on inflation, and hence on central banks. And the last element will be that, as we mentioned, decelerating growth. It means probably that the micro and the let's say the earnings will decelerate too. And this usually means that you don't have to be very much long cyclicals, but you have to be a bit more defensive. So to cut a long story short, on our view, we remain constructive on equities, but we think that the tilts should be probably less cyclicals. 2021 was the continuation of the recovery story. Now we are more on the consolidation side and soft landing, so lower deceleration in earnings growth and more defensive, although we remain positive. And obviously you need to take some edges and be tactical. One point I can add maybe is usually a question we ask is whether we should be more US on Europe. I think it's going to be tough this year and next year. On the European side, we discussed it with Dirk. The cyclical forces remain probably more stronger with less deceleration. But on the other hand, we know that the US equity sector has higher pricing power, higher return on equities, and also there's these share buybacks forces that is very, very active. So again, I would not have a very clear-cut view on US versus Europe. I think both markets are interesting and more interesting than emerging markets.
Obvious question following your point, Florent. You said we had this good surprise regarding earnings. Does it mean that the valuation are not something to be worried about? Because we see that the new record high every time on the stock market. What do you say about valuation in this context?
Well, it's always the same story. Valuation on the absolute level are pretty high, but they are not super high. So remember, for instance, the forward PE of the S&P is 22. Currently, it's not the all-time high. It's far from that. If you look at CAPE, cyclical adjusted PE, we are high. If you look at the Schiller website, we're at 38. So this is pretty high, but it's not the all-time high. So we are high. But remember also that this year was not a PE expansion story. It was, again, an earnings recovery. There has been no PE expansion this year. So this is the first one.
It's cheaper than last year in a way.
On an absolute basis, maybe, yeah. But after, it's always the same. So stocks are expensive on an absolute basis. On a relative basis, they are not the most expensive asset class. We talked about bonds. If you look at our cross-asset monitor indicators, you can see that we have a specific section when we look at valuation stories, and you can see that indicators for bonds, for instance, are higher than for equities. So typically for equities, we are 2 times above average in terms of standard deviation, above the average in terms of valuations. Okay, so and for bonds, we are more around 3 times the standard deviation. So again, stocks are expensive, that's true, but they are not the most expensive. And this is all the story about QE. Every asset is expensive. This means that we have more sensitivity. You talked about volatility, and obviously there will be more sensitivity of stocks towards potential negative shocks. This means first, the 2 risks are first fundamental risk. If we do have more GDP deceleration, it means that earnings will be lower and decelerate more sharply. And the second shock, the second risk is obviously the interest rate risk. And I think this is probably the key story, at least for the early part of next year, as, again, the market will try to really see how the central banks will behave. And we may have, again, something which is similar to 2018 scenario when we saw repricing in bonds and then potential impact on equities. And typically, if you look at econometrics, you could have some kind of ideas, which is 40 or 50 basis point increase in interest rates could trigger, when stocks are pretty expensive, up to 10 to 15% drawdown in equities. So again, I'm not saying things are going to be rosy next year. We remain positive, but there are some risks that we find some shocks, especially from the interest rate side.
Very interesting. Finally, maybe on inflation, Florent, how do you play out this major tail risk of inflation? How do you play that, or do you hedge yourself against inflation going forward?
Yeah, so I think this is, again, a very complex story, nothing simple. So we've done a piece earlier on cross-expertise on inflation, where we detail some views. I think there are three takeaways we had on that piece. The first one is that when you have very hyperinflation, there's nothing that really hedges you. The best hedge is cash. Cash, you have some
gold, Bitcoin,
gold. I'm not sure Bitcoin. It's too new. But you have gold. You had some REITs and you had a bit of small caps. But basically, nothing is really beating the cash. Now, another thing which is really important when you have high inflation is that this traditional safe havens for bonds is no longer true, which means that you have a positive equity bond correlation. And this, of course, is very difficult to manage when you manage a diversified portfolio. So this means that you should find other, let's say, safe havens and probably more, let's say, alternative strategies. Can be long-short strategies on equities. It could be long-short strategies on commodities. It could be others, but it cannot be bonds only. And the third one is, of course, the best case is if you believe that you have a cyclical inflation, then it's much easier. This is the chart that is displayed here. Then you should go more towards energy, financials, industrial metals, and of course break-even inflations. But to cut a long story short, it's tough to have a perfect edge on inflation. I think that one view we have for next year is also that dollar is very interesting because again, dollar could be an edge against high inflation in the US, hence a more aggressive Fed, and it's also a safe haven in terms of market turmoil. So this is something we like in terms of a portfolio edge.
Thank you very much, Florent. And I like very much your remark regarding Bitcoin as an edge against inflation, because at the end of the day, Bitcoin was born in 2013, and since then we didn't get any inflation for real. So just now we get a bit of inflation, but we don't know yet if it's a good edge against inflation so far. So thank you very much, Florent and Cyril. Time is ticking up. We're running out of our promised time. So thank you all for joining us today again. Please take a look at this document that we are publishing today on this subject of 2022 at log. You can follow us on Natixis Research and take a look if you want at our website, natixis.research.com. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time. Bye-bye.